In 1983, a teenager went missing in Red Bluff, California. Her body would be found on the same day, but after a false confession and rumors, advanced DNA technology would bring the breakthrough to identify the perpetrator. On March 3, 1983, 14-year-old Rachell Lee Ward was abducted while walking to school in Red Bluff. Later in the morning after Rachell went missing, sheriff's detectives were called to the area of Pine Creek Road, west of Red Bluff, where they found the body of a young female who had been bound, assaulted, and shot. The body was then identified as Rachell Ward. During the initial phases of the investigation, the sheriff's office sifted through numerous potential suspects, suspect vehicles, and took an overwhelming number of tips. The detectives also interviewed many others and vetted them for possible involvement. At one point, Henry Lee Lucas, known as the confession perpetrator, claimed responsibility for Rachell's end, but the detectives eliminated him due to inconsistencies in his confession. There were other rumors around town, including one was that the sheriff at the time, Ron Koenig, was involved, but no evidence supported the rumors. The detectives continued to interview witnesses, leads were pursued, and DNA samples were taken. As DNA technology advanced, officials resubmitted evidence for DNA analysis, but to no avail. Over the years, the case took several twists and turns, but work on the case continued, even as new detectives became involved. Almost 4 decades later, in 2022, the detectives discussed a new investigative approach involving the development of leads from family trees constructed using investigative genealogy. Detectives learned that a rootless strand of hair recovered from the victim, but that did not belong to her, could be tested to obtain a possible lead through this new ancestral DNA analysis. The sheriff's office also got assistance from the FBI and the California Department of Justice to develop leads using the new genealogy approach. The sheriff's office then contracted with Estrella Forensics and submitted the hair strand collected earlier. The results gave investigators a possible new suspect, Johnny Lee Coy, a former Red Bluff resident who had been convicted of kidnapping and assaulting a 21-year-old woman in Tehama County in 1989. The Tehama Sheriff's Office said in a news release, "This would not have been possible if not for all the hardworking, dedicated detectives throughout the years that spent countless hours trying to get justice for Rachell Ward." Coy was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, where he passed away in 2019. The DNA collected up to that point was not specific to Coy, though. The detectives needed help from Coy's family to narrow down the DNA match. Officials said, detectives located several family members and explained the situation. The family members agreed to assist and voluntarily provided a DNA sample to be compared against the DNA recovered from evidence located in 1983 by the California Department of Justice lab. Testing of family members came back with the same conclusion, that the DNA recovered in 1983 was a close relative to the family. A DNA sample taken from Coy when he was in prison originally did not have the same markers, but officials had the sample retested. In October 2023, the sheriff's office was notified that the DNA from the hair strand matched Coy's. Officials with the Tehama County District Attorney's Office concluded that if Coy was still alive, there would be enough evidence to charge him with the assault and slaying of Rachell. Officials said, "The Tehama County Sheriff's Office is pleased to offer the family of Rachell Ward closure in this case after all these years. We are also pleased to be able to clear the name of former Sheriff Koenig of any criminal involvement in this case." Rachell's sister, Andrea Gum, expressed how she felt knowing Coy was not alive to answer for his crimes. She said, "You cannot yell or scream at him or tell him what he took away from you, and that is really hard." She also explained that although it is nice to have closure, it does not bring her sister back. It is not going to bring her back. It is not going to change anything. I guess in a sense, knowing that he has passed away, the person that actually took her life, that is a relief. Yvonne Le Roux's lifeless body was found in 1972 in Canada, but DNA found on the scene would only be tested more than 5 decades later. 16-year-old Yvonne Le Roux was last seen on the night of November 29, 1972, walking in the area of Oakdale Road and Finch Avenue West in Toronto, Canada. The next morning, her body was found on a side road in the township of King, 24 kilometers north. She had lost her life due to blunt force trauma to the head. Dozens of investigators worked on the case over the years, and the York Regional Police Services Board had twice issued a $50,000 reward linked to the case, but to no avail. The case went cold. For years, no one knew who ended her life until November 2023. Using suspect DNA found at the crime scene, which thankfully was secured at the time and preserved for more than 50 years, a DNA profile was generated and then uploaded to public genealogical databases. Armed with that new information, alongside a review of public and archival records, as well as evidence gathered at the time Yvonne's body was found, investigators narrowed their search down to the perpetrator's relatives, and then, finally, to the perpetrator himself. The police announced that the investigative tool, investigative genetic genealogy, coupled with preserved DNA evidence from the scene, had pointed detectives to a Toronto man named Bruce Charles Cantillon. Cantillon took his own life in 1974, 19 months after Yvonne's demise. The 26-year-old was known to the police at the time, having committed several violent offenses against women, and having been incarcerated at various points in his life due to mental health issues. The officers said that if Cantillon was still alive, he would have been charged with slaying. Deputy Chief Alvaro Almeida called the incident cruel and ruthless. Chief Almeida said, "Despite the sad circumstances of Yvonne's demise, I am gratified to be able to deliver her family this resolution, if not closure. I cannot imagine how difficult it must have been, living all these years with such a loss and not knowing, all this time, who is responsible." Detective Jonathan Nauman told the reporters that Cantillon's relatives were cooperative with the police, though investigators stressed the immense toll Yvonne's end has taken on her family. Nauman said it has been hard for Cantillon's family too. He said, "Learning 51 years later that someone they knew had done something so horrible, it is not easy for them either." The investigators say that they do not know of any connection between Yvonne and Cantillon, nor are they able to speculate on a motive in her demise. No weapon was ever found. In a statement read aloud at the news conference, Yvonne's family said that she is far from forgotten and noted how her end has affected them through many generations. The family said, "The case has remained a focus of attention in family gatherings and beyond, and has brought experiences we would not wish on anyone. Unfortunately, this news came late, as many of our family members have recently passed. For over half a century, our family has wondered. Getting some answers will never change what happened or bring her back." In 1973, Georgie Cannaday was found deceased in her Oklahoma home. The investigation would turn cold until a phone call would lead to a breakthrough 5 decades later. On June 28, 1973, 48-year-old Georgie Cannaday's body was found on the floor near the foot of her bed in her rural home in Jay, Oklahoma. Her body was rolled up in a braided rug. The top of her dress covered her head and face. The lower part of her dress was pushed up around her waist. Georgie's pet poodle was found alive, snuggled up to her body. She was an impeccable housekeeper, and nearly everything in her home appeared to be in order. Robbery was ruled out because her purse was found near her body and contained her personal papers and 18 $1 bills and some change. There were no signs of a struggle and no forced entry. The last time Georgie was seen by anyone was 2 days earlier, on June 26th, when she stopped by her neighbor's house to pick up her mail and visit. Named after her father, Georgie was one of 8 children. She beat the odds right as her life began, weighing just 2 pounds at birth. In 1925, there were no incubators for premature babies, so the family used a makeshift oven for those first few days of her life to keep her warm. Her niece, Wanda Forster, said, She was simple, childlike, almost like a 10-year-old in an adult body. Georgie had some minor intellectual difficulties, and it was noted on her autopsy that she was disabled and on welfare. She lived alone in the house her father left her when he passed away in March 1973, just 3 months before Georgie was slain. She rarely left home, and most people considered the plainly dressed woman a recluse. In the final weeks of her life, she confided in neighbors, Johnny and Frances Bird, that she was worried about having to move and give up her home. She also confided in another neighbor, Elizabeth Landrum, that although she loved her family, she did not want to move to her sister's Spavinaw home, and she was afraid someone would burn her house down because a month earlier, a neighbor's house was destroyed by fire. For decades, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation classified Georgie's case as an open, inactive cold case. 48 years after the crime happened, in 2021, Delaware County Sheriff James Beck formed a cold case unit to look at several Delaware County cold cases, making good on a campaign promise. The oldest case, and perhaps the one thought to be the most unsolvable, was Georgie's case. In 1973, crime scene photos took days to develop. Reports were painstakingly typewritten, and if a mistake was made, the report had to be retyped. Also, DNA were just letters in the alphabet to these lawmen. Georgie's great-niece, Christina Asp, picked up the torch, searching for justice for a woman she had never met. Over time, Christina did get to know her great-aunt through family stories and photographs. She said, "I feel like I do know her from all the stories from my aunt and mother-in-law. Their faces would light up when they shared memories of her." In October 2021, after a night of poring over photographs, Christina picked up the telephone and reached out to the OSBI, inquiring about her great-aunt's 50-year-old case. She said, "Several of the aunts had made promises to Georgie's mother that they would continue looking for her perpetrator. Several of us family members are continuing what they started." What frustrated the family, as well as members of the cold case unit, was that the original crime scene photographs, reports, evidence, and other pertinent documents could not be found. After weeks of interviews, Detective Mark Wall and Sheriff Beck compiled an investigation file, 3 inches thick, filled with old interviews, new interviews, a crime scene summary, and yellowed newspaper articles. Due to forensic anthropologist Angela Berg's hard work, the 5-page autopsy report was found. Initially, Georgie's demise was ruled undetermined, but the report was amended to show she lost her life from strangulation. Both sides of her larynx and hyoid bone were extensively fractured. On July 3, 2023, Detective Wall received a telephone call from a woman whom read about Georgie's cold case and felt compelled to come forward with her father's 40-year-old secret. Detective Wall said, her parents had bought the old Cannaday home and became good friends with one neighbor who eventually passed away from cancer. The cancer-ridden neighbor confided to her parents that years earlier he had heard a confession from a man who lived near Georgie. The other man confessed to him that he ended Georgie's life with 2 other men. They had not planned on slaying Georgie, but things got out of hand and it went too far. This confession was confirmed by a woman who asked to remain anonymous. Kurt Titsworth, with the OSBI Cold Case Unit and Detective Wall, spent weeks following up and interviewing friends and family members of both suspects. What slowly emerged, Detective Wall said of Suspect 1, who was 76-year-old at the time, was a portrait of a strange man. He had quirky behaviors. For example, he was always suspicious of his neighbors, and he had a reputation of always carrying a gun and sneaking around back roads in rural Delaware County all night long. The second suspect was 16-year-old at the time. His history of strangling women pushed his name to the top of the list of suspects. Also, the fact that his family had a key to Georgie's home. OSBI agent Leo Albro wanted him to take a lie detector test in 1973. But Detective Wall said that he did not believe the teen ever submitted to a test due to him being a juvenile. Already known for having a dangerous reputation, the teen was notorious for telling people he was attracted to older women and not teenage girls his own age. The first suspect passed away in 1994, and the juvenile suspect lost his life in 2020. On August 7th, it was announced that this 50-year-old cold case is finally solved. Sheriff Beck said, "We believe 2 men took the life of Cannaday. Both were known to her, both had violent histories, and both lived close by." Detective Wall said, "Since one suspect was a juvenile and both suspects are deceased, we cannot release their names because we cannot prosecute them." Sheriff Beck added, "We have contacted the family and told them the case is officially closed. Not being able to officially release their names to the family is frustrating for the lawmen. The family has always wondered, what if she had moved in with a sister?" Christina said, "It is a very sad ending to a beautiful life. She was very loved, and all who knew her were devastated by how her life ended. May those men serve time for her demise in the afterlife." Remains were found in 1994 in Florida. The perpetrator confessed, but he did not know her name. The case went cold until she was identified almost 3 decades later. On September 15th, 1994, the District 1 Medical Examiner's Office received the skeletonized remains of a female found near Interstate 10 in Florida. During the initial investigation, the remains were sent to the CA Pound Human Identification Laboratory in Gainesville by Dr. Keelman. An osteological examination showed the remains to be that of a white female aged approximately 35 to 55 years. Samples were sent for entomological examination for estimation of the time since her demise. In February 1996, Keith Jesperson, the serial perpetrator known nationally as the Happy Face perpetrator, admitted to an Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office investigator that he was responsible for ending the life of a Jane Doe in August 1994 and dumping her body near the Holt exit on Interstate 10. He told investigator Glenn Barbary that he believed the woman's name was Susan or Suzette. In 2007, a forensic artist completed a new facial reconstruction in hopes of identifying the victim, but it did not generate any leads. In 2008, the remains were sent for additional anthropological examination at the University of West Florida. Specimens were sent to the FBI laboratory for DNA analysis and entered into the National Missing Person DNA database. Despite the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and District 1 Medical Examiner's Office working decades to positively identify the woman, her name remained a mystery. That changed almost 3 decades later. Chrissy Knighton, chief investigator with the District 1 Medical Examiner's Office, said, "In 2023, the D1 MEO sent samples to Othram and, with funding through the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, a genealogical profile produced leads that led to Suzanne Kjellenberg's identification. In September, OCSO investigators Kelly Henderson and Aaron Pittman, along with Mark Zagar from the FDLE and Assistant State Attorney Michelle Sandler, traveled to the Oregon State Penitentiary, where Jesperson is currently serving 7 life sentences for the slayings of 7 other women across the country while he worked as a long-haul trucker. Jesperson, who was unaware until that morning of the group's arrival, met with them unannounced and provided additional details, which law enforcement was not previously aware of. Sheriff Eric Aiden said, "As of today's date, Jesperson has been charged with the slaying of Suzanne Kjellenberg. Suzanne, who was 34 at the time of her end, currently has family in Wisconsin. Notification has been made to her next of kin, who expressed gratitude for the perseverance of investigators, the Medical Examiner's Office, and the FDLE. They also asked for privacy to cope with this new development." At the Oregon State Penitentiary, Jesperson outlined again to investigators that he met the victim at a truck stop near Tampa in August 1994, and they traveled to a rest area in the Panhandle. While at the rest area, Jesperson was parked next to a security guard and the victim was sleeping in his bed. When he sat next to her, He says she began screaming and would not stop. Jesperson told the investigators that he was not allowed to have unauthorized riders in his truck. He did not want to draw the security guard's attention, so he stopped her from breathing by pushing his fist against her neck. He later placed zip ties around her throat as well. Jesperson left the area and drove to the Holt exit on Interstate 10, where he disposed of her body. It was found by an inmate work crew in the tree row on September 14, 1994. Jesperson is known as the Happy Face perpetrator due to letters he wrote to the media detailing his crimes signed with a smiley face. Sheriff Aiden said, "Thanks to the tireless efforts of so many over so long, the remains of Suzanne Kjellenberg, the final unidentified victim of Jesperson's cross-country slaying sprees, can finally leave the medical examiner's office and return home." 2 sisters were found deceased in 1942 in New Zealand. The initial detective's son would solve the case 40 years later after reading about the perpetrator in a book. On August 21, 1942, Annie and Rosamond Smyth were found deceased by a neighbor in their Salvation Army home in Wairoa, New Zealand. Both were found lifeless from multiple head injuries inflicted with an axe and, in the case of Rosamond, who lost her life in the bedroom, with an iron fire poker. The police believed that they were slain 13 days earlier on August 8th. 62-year-old Brigadier Annie Smyth and her sister, 74-year-old Rosamond, had their home in the town's Salvation Army Hall. Annie, an ardent evangelist, had spent much of her adult life as a missionary in Japan, and she had an affection for the country and its people. That and her domineering manner made enemies of some when New Zealand was at war with Japan. At the sisters' Wellington funeral, the Salvation Army Commissioner J. Evan Smith said it appeared that a vindictive person had resented Annie's denunciation of sin. She was well known for attacking evil and could even be considered a Christian martyr, while Rosamond was kind, unassuming, and gracious. During the investigation, it was revealed that 2 visitors had been at the house, both on August 9th. One was a woman who passed through the Smith's kitchen, not noticing the body of Annie lying in a damaged Morris chair. The visitor went into the hall to pray. The other visitor was an 8-year-old girl who had been playing with other children nearby. She entered the house, saw Annie, and carried on playing, throwing pillows out a window to children who threw them back. She told neither playmates nor her parents of the grisly find because she was too frightened. Both women's clothing was disordered in a way that suggested a sexual motive, but there was no evidence of assault. Nor did robbery appear to be the motive, as money was found in both sisters' possessions. The slayings were investigated by Detective Bruce Young, but he was unable to bring anyone to book and went to his grave in 1952 with the case unsolved. 30 years later, in 1982, Bruce's son, Sherwood Young, was reading a book by former lawyer George Israel Joseph, By Person or Persons Unknown, which mentioned a client of his, whom Joseph called X. This man, when passing of cancer, had asked to see Joseph and told him that he ended the lives of the Smiths. Sherwood Young, who had followed his grandfather's calling into the New Zealand police and, at that time, held the rank of inspector, contacted Joseph for more information. He told the lawyer that he was Bruce Young's grandson, and the Smith slayings were his grandfather's cases that had never been solved. Joseph then said that 20 years earlier, in 1962, Leo Sylvester Hannon confessed to ending the lives of Annie and Rosamond, as well as that of Herbert William Brunton. Hannon was sentenced to life in prison 12 years earlier, in 1950, for taking the life of Frederick Andrew Stade. In October 1962, Hannon lost his life after he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. With this knowledge, Sherwood was able to posthumously solve his grandfather Bruce's cases. He was also able to confirm that Hannon was a serial perpetrator